Welcome back to Free Speech TV's Newswire. I'm Jared Jakang-Mayer. Jobs and how to create more of them has become the primary talking point for politicians from local city halls to the White House. This comes amid recent figures that showed weaker than expected job growth and a persistently high unemployment rate of 9.1% nationwide. But Andy Kroll says that we can't talk about unemployment without also talking about race. He's a reporter for Mother Jones Magazine and an associate editor at TomDispatch.com. He joins us via Skype from Washington. Andy, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
So before we get into some of the arguments that you brought up in your piece, I want to show this slate of some of the statistics that shows that nationwide there's an unemployment rate of about 9.1%, but for whites it's about 8% unemployment, and for blacks it's at a high of 16.2%. That's double the rate that whites are suffering from as far as unemployment. Everyone's talking about jobs. Why aren't we talking about race?
I think it has something to do with the election of President Obama. You know, we heard a lot about how this country was entering something of a post-racial era. It was a catchphrase that was being knocked around a lot. But, you know, these job figures that you bring up and I write about in this story show that, you know, we're hardly in some sort of post-racial era, and you know, there are very serious and very dire inequalities between whites and blacks, and that break down by race. And you know, so far the coverage of this issue has been really, really poor and frankly non-existent.
And you point out in your piece that in certain communities and areas and cities that the unemployment rate for African Americans is even higher in those areas. But this isn't something that just came out of the blue in the recent recession. This high unemployment among African Americans is something that goes back decades.
Yeah, I mean, I first picked up on it just looking at, you know, recent months, you know, in 2011, and saw this 2 times disparity between whites and blacks in unemployment, and I figured it was, you know, a product of the recession. But really, when you go back and look at, you know, historical data, it traces back to the post World War II era, and it, you know, it's held steady somehow, amazingly, ever since.
So poor schools in certain urban areas, the high prison population among African Americans, all these things contribute to this high rate of unemployment. But you also argue that it has something more deep than that. It has to do with race and racism in the U.S.
Yeah, you can talk about education, you can talk about, you know, globalization and outsourcing and hollowing out of inner cities, but none of those gives a full enough explanation. And you've really got to look to issues of hiring discrimination and plainly racism that people thought we'd gotten past either with the civil rights movement or, you know, with the electing Obama. But we clearly haven't, and there's a whole wealth of academic research to back that up. And you know, it's a problem we need to first acknowledge and then try to tackle.
And a lot of these issues, once you dig down to it, they're deep, they're systematic. How can we actually, how can our government, how can politicians expect to actually take hold of this issue and do anything about it?
Well, we could put more emphasis on the anti-discrimination legislation we have, or try to create new legislation to tackle the problem. And you can also look at the issue of just directly creating jobs in hard-hit areas. You bypass the discrimination and you're putting people back to work, directly subsidizing those jobs.
So you'd like to see more of a direct stimulus, not only for jobs, but jobs among African Americans. But that's a pretty tall order for the current political climate.
Yeah, the conversation about spending right now in D.C. is, you know, it begins and ends on how much to cut. But it's hard to see, apart from new legislation on tackling the issue of discrimination, how you're actually going to close this gap instead of just yakking about it or ignoring it outright. And, you know, the economists I talk to stress, you know, the ones that consider spending a good thing, at least, say that, you know, direct job creation is one of the few proven ideas out there.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks a lot for joining us, Andy.
Thank you.
Andy Kroll, he's a reporter from Mother Jones, and he's also the associate editor at TomDispatch. You can read his article about unemployment and the African American community at TomDispatch.com.